I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest from Ukraine and look at a number of diplomatic moves in Europe that may see Western trainers in Ukraine and Western weapons in Russia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 28th of May, 2 years and 95 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started with the latest news from Ukraine. The big news over the weekend was this horrific strike on the hardware store, very large sort of multiplex hypermarket in Kharkiv. The last report I saw was 17 dead, 48 injured. Footage has been released. You'll find it on social media from inside the store at the time of the attack. It immediately and irrevocably refutes this idea that there was any sort of, well, I'm not even going to say the Russian stuff, but it's a hardware store, and you can see a lot of people in probably the last moments of their lives. So it's a very somber reminder of what is going on, and a reminder of quite how quickly Russia immediately comes out and says, it's a military target, X, Y, and Z. Nonsense. But 17 dead at the moment, 48 injured. Then across the weekend, mainly on Sunday, strikes in Mykolaiv, Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Kharkiv and Donetsk Oblast added to more civilian deaths and injuries. Luhansk, Sumy and Zaporizhia Oblasts also came under attack, but amazingly no casualties reported there. But again, sort of highlights exactly what a quote-unquote normal or regular day in Ukraine is. Elsewhere, a little move across the lines. The area to the northeast of Kharkiv, around Vovchansk, and that sort of whatever that thing is up there, an incursion, a diversion, who knows what. It's not doing an awful lot of either of those things. There's very little movement there. Ukrainian forces geolocated to have made very small advances near Lipsky. That's one on the sort of western side of that. So Vovchansk is the main, is the larger area and the larger town. That's to the east, but around the Lipsky, that other blob. There's a little bit of movement there. Ukrainian forces taking back a bit of territory. It's squeezing up against the river, which makes the geography somewhat more favourable to the defenders or to counterattack there. And then today, over the weekend and this morning, a number of diplomatic moves, which deep into the realm of Joe here. Really appreciate you coming on today, Joe. But this morning, I note Ukraine and Belgium have signed a bilateral security agreement, which includes the delivery of 30 F-16 fighters. So President Zelensky's in Brussels today. He's on a bit of a sort of mini European tour. He's in Brussels today. Signed the agreement with Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. And then in a social media post, Mr. Zelensky said the document includes at least 977 million euros in Belgian military aid to Ukraine this year, as well as Belgium's commitment to providing support over the course of the agreement's 10-year term, the sort of latest in this bilateral 10-year defence agreements, whether or not they all add up to. In fact, Joe, here you go. Here's your starter for 10. Do you think having a number of 10, and in some cases more, years defence agreements with on a bilateral basis, can there be any number of those that ever meet the line of a NATO Article 5 guarantee? Hello, Joe.
Yes, let's drag it back to Vilnius, where NATO leaders met for their annual summit of 2023. Ukraine was vying for membership of NATO, which includes Article 5, the mutual defence clause that states an attack on one is an attack on all, and basically everyone comes to the aid of that country. It didn't get that, but the G7 came up with, that's the sort of the industrialized countries, the top 7 economies, well, in Europe, I guess, in America, G7 democracies, let's call them, came up with an idea of, look, we can start building these security guarantees that basically enshrine our commitments to Ukraine in legal documents. Britain signed it, France has done one, Germany's done one, America's still negotiating its version, Spain yesterday, Belgium's turn today. Not G7 countries, but Belgium's offered a billion euros in military support and promised that it will deliver 30 F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. The 10-year point, these things are expected to be rolled over. But I guess you don't want to say we want a 20 or 30-year date, because these are meant to be stopgaps between Ukraine being told you're going to join NATO one day and the time that comes. You don't want to dampen the Ukrainian spirits too much by saying, well, it's a 100-year deal. That's when you can join NATO after that. So that's really what that is.
I see. So it's not like a kind of lukewarm support saying you're only getting 10 years. They're actually more keen to say, well, look, we don't want to put it any longer so that we're not sort of situating the narrative. Interesting. I'd not thought of it that way. Interesting. Thanks, Joe. Now, I noticed today from the Kyiv Independent, EU ministers are said to be frustrated at Hungary. Hungary's blocked a $7 billion aid package for Ukraine. Hungary's foreign minister reportedly received sharp criticism, as they're reporting, from his EU colleagues over the weekend, yesterday in fact, as Budapest stalled the €6.5 billion, $7 billion military aid package. The quote was, this is a diplomatic source speaking to Reuters, reported in the Kyiv Independent, tempers ran quite high. The exchanges were among the most heated in years among EU foreign ministers. So, Joe, where is Hungary at the moment? Are they still the sort of playing the petulant act and eventually falling into line, or is this much more significant, do you think?
Yeah, it appears to be much more significant because there's some really strange sort of things coming out of Hungary. But I'll talk through what's going on. So the EU has promised €6.5 billion worth of military support for Ukraine. That's for weapons deliveries. Plus, the EU has its own training mission as well. But to get this through, it requires the support of each member state, so all 27. And our regular listeners will know that Hungary has positioned itself in a space in the world between Europe and Russia. It continues to do business with Russia. It doesn't really condone Russia. It says the invasion's bad and we don't agree with it, but it doesn't really go after and attack Russia for that. And Viktor Orban is described as Vladimir Putin's best friend in Europe. Hungary itself doesn't deliver weapons to Ukraine, and that's basically what it's saying here is, why should we deliver weapons? Because we believe weapon deliveries are only extending the war. That's Viktor Orban's view on it. So he's basically instructed his ministers to block the EU attempts to get these funds to Ukraine, and it's really triggered some sort of real anger amongst their EU counterparts who are really keen to support Ukraine. You had Gabrielius Landsbergis, who's the Lithuanian foreign minister, came out and got an incredible rant, basically saying that, look, we need to rip up the EU's rule book because Hungary is responsible for blocking so much. We're being held hostage by Hungary, not just on Ukraine, but on other issues as well. So he was saying almost all of our discussions and needed solutions and decisions by the EU are being blocked by just one country. So we have to start seeing this as a systematic approach towards any efforts by the EU to have a meaningful role in foreign affairs. That's what Landsbergis had to say. So it's a really tricky one. Again, to take it back, Hungary has always backed EU sanctions against Russia, even though it disagrees with them. It's slightly watered them down to a certain degree. It's not blocked weapons packages up until the most recent attempt. So there's about 5 billion in EU funds has gone to Ukraine for weapons and training, and now we're at this point of it's being blocked. So it's sort of hard to tell what Hungary wants. So before Ukraine was offered accession talks to join the EU, Hungary was given 10 billion euros in basically money that was owed to it, but was being held back because of a rule of law dispute. There's not much more you can give to Hungary as sort of a bit of a carrot, money for old rope as such. So it seems like Hungary are really digging in, and there just isn't any way through it unless you sort of rip up the EU rulebook and change the rules to make it so it's not unanimity. But that's going to require Hungary's confirmation as well. So that's the issue. But basically, apparently, this is from me speaking to sort of sources. The Hungarian foreign minister was actually sort of really berated at times and really called out and criticised vocally by most countries. Normally people try to be patient. They try to keep up diplomatic language. But apparently, there was a few sort of choice words being used against him. And it's just interesting because I assume the latest sort of blockage is part of Hungary's European election campaign. Viktor Orban sort of campaigning domestically for his sort of Eurosceptic conservatives to win the elections there, because there's some interesting things coming out. They landed in Brussels yesterday, the Hungarian delegation, claiming that we were here to vote against some sort of European conscription scheme. But the only people mentioning European conscription scheme is Hungary itself. So yeah, look, God knows what's really going on in Hungary. It's one of the harder countries to read. But what I can say is, yeah, they are holding up a hell of a lot of money, which would be very useful for Ukraine in the next year or so.
So do you think Viktor Orban sees Ukraine as just a way that he can make it work for himself domestically? He just holds these things up, gets a bit of bunts from the EU and then says okay, and then he holds the next thing up, gets a bit more, EU coffers, and off we go again. So tried and tested methodology, probably about to be expected in the way that the whole bureaucracy is set up. But I just wonder how much he actually is a bit of a glove puppet for Putin, as has been suggested, and how much he's just working for him domestically. And I wonder, you might probably not be able to answer that, Joe, but on all these occasions where he says things like, we don't want to send weapons to Ukraine, we don't want to prolong the war. Is he ever pushed when he says that? People say, OK, so do you want negotiations now? And do you see negotiations as Russia gets everything that it wants, comes back in 10 years and tries to smash the place up again, or meaningful negotiations about leaving the territory of Ukraine? Is he ever pushed on those other points? Has he ever sort of expounded an idea on what he sees as the what comes next?
Yeah, so he is a sort of a vocal supporter of the idea of peace talks, and Hungary has actually offered to host peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, offering itself up as a neutral territory in the past. But yeah, he does get pushed. Viktor Orban himself and his ministers that travel here, they do get pushed on things, but they very rarely, from what I am told, come up with genuine answers. They just sort of say, look, a ceasefire and peace talks are what's needed. That's where we stand on that issue. We don't need to express any further. And then on the idea of, is Viktor Orban a glove puppet, a sock puppet, whatever we want to call him, for Putin? I think it's reasonable to say the jury's out. But the reason he does that, I do see, and I spent, when was I in Hungary for a week or so, sort of meeting ministers to try and get into their mindset before the decision was made on the European Union membership issue for Ukraine last year. And they say, but everything we do is domestic focus. We use the EU to basically deliver for our voters. We use our business with Russia to make sure that while everyone else's heating prices is going up, ours are staying stabilised when people can afford to drive cars. They do business with China when people don't want to do business with China because they see it as China's willing to invest in our economy and build road infrastructure or whatever. But yeah, that's the sort of thing. Everything Viktor Orban does is for what he says is the benefit of his voters at home. So I'm sure we should one day try and get some Hungarian voters on and see what they say about it. But yeah, he frames everything he does for domestic consumption. And he's been very successful on it. He's 10 years in power or so. He's the longest serving EU leader now. Well, he has been, even I think before Mark Rutte. But yeah, whatever he does works for him. He's highly successful and tends to get what he wants and turns a profit out of the EU. So whether he's extorting them over Ukraine, it seems to be working still. So he'll probably continue.
Yeah, he probably will. It's a sort of living embodiment of the phrase, no country has permanent friends, only permanent interests. And yet, where does that come crashing up against a bloc, EU, Nato? Where does that idea hit the sort of permanency of an alliance? Anyway, thought for another day. Now, Joe, a lot of talk now, which in diplomatic terms, you'll know better than me, but a lot of diplomatic talk which could mean movement on the issue of Western troops operating inside Ukraine and the issue of the use of Western donated munitions being used against and inside Russia. So on the first part of that, I note today NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he was speaking this morning at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Sofia in Bulgaria, and he said, it's a bit long, but please stick with me, I think this is important. He said, I've suggested that at the summit, that's the NATO 75th summit coming up in Washington in July, I've suggested that at the summit we agree a big NATO role in coordinating and providing security assistance and training for Ukraine. I expect that by the summit in Washington we will agree a stronger NATO role in organising, providing, planning, delivering supplies to ensure more stable flows of supplies to Ukraine. Now, I must say in Q&A later, Mr. Stoltenberg did say we have no plans to start training inside Ukraine. He then carried on. He said, we made it clear that we will not be party to the conflict. We will not have NATO combat troops on the ground. But Joe, I note he emphasised the word combat there. We will not have NATO combat troops on the ground. So all those things considered, sort of putting a lot of pressure on the summit in July in Washington, and we hope to be there. That particular reference to combat troops, which I thought was interesting. Joe, do you think the ground's shifting at all there?
I think there's quite an interesting distinction to make, and it's almost slightly deliberate deception from NATO, from Stoltenberg, from NATO allies. So when a country, whether it be a NATO member or not, supports Ukraine, it does that bilaterally. So if Britain was to send, and Downing Street has confirmed that we have people doing medical training there and sort of diplomatic protection staff. So I would call those, whether they not be combat troops, but they are serving members of our armed forces. They are in Ukraine. They are there as a Brit, not as a NATO troop, despite them being NATO. So basically, we're talking about Article 5 and how does that cover. And I've actually had a few discussions about that this week. So I'm off to Prague because NATO foreign ministers are meeting on Thursday. So I've been speaking to a few sort of diplomats ahead of that, and they're basically saying, look, you can do this. France, if it wants to send, and we're going to cover this later, or Britain, if it wants to send, America, if it wants to send troops to train Ukrainian troops in Ukraine, and they're attacked, is that really sufficient to cover Article 5 or trigger Article 5? The answer is probably no, because they are there on their own fruition. It's not an attack on NATO itself. But, for instance, if Russia was to suddenly bomb the factory where Storm Shadows and Scalps are made, that is an attack on NATO territory. So that's going to trigger Article 5. So what Jens Stoltenberg is saying basically is, look, NATO itself has no plans to send combat troops, but bilaterally countries are considering that. We'll speak about the French in a minute. I've mentioned the Brits and various other people. So it's a slight use of words to match and basically keep in check what was said at the beginning of the conflict, one of the earliest meetings that NATO had, when it promised that NATO would not come into direct conflict with Russia over its support for Ukraine. And that is where sort of this twisting and turning of language is happening. And it's becoming harder to draw a line. France has signed agreements to send troops. Britain has troops in Ukraine. I'm sure other countries do as well. But they're not there on NATO missions per se, but they are NATO troops. So it's one of those ones where we've got to really twist your head around the language, basically to stop Vladimir Putin trying to escalate the war and allaying fears from certain countries like the US, like Germany, who are fearful that too much NATO involvement will escalate the conflict.
Yeah, and you're right. I think it's trying to dominate the or get the initiative on the narrative, if you like. I note that Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski is very clear on this. He's very keen to take back control, to coin a phrase, blimey, about the language and make Putin guess where the useful ambiguity is from the Western side. And you mentioned France a couple of times there, Joe. France, over the weekend, there were some comments adding to recent comments from President Macron about French troops operating and training inside Ukraine. They were very quickly jumped on by General Syrski, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, who was sort of, right, brilliant, we'll see you next Tuesday, lads, or words to that effect. And it did generate a bit of steam over the weekend, such that I note the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense this morning put out a social media tweet and said, clarification regarding numerous requests from the mass media regarding the reception of instructors from partner countries. Starting from February 2024, Ukraine expressed interest in the prospect of receiving foreign instructors in Ukraine. As of now, we are still in discussions with France and other countries on the issue. The Ministry of Defence, together with the General Staff, started internal work on the relevant documents on this issue in order not to waste time on coordinating bureaucratic issues when the appropriate decision will be made. So, Joe, sounds like they're rowing back on Syrski's comments.
Yeah, I think so. Look, there's no doubt that a bit of paper has been signed between the French and the Ukrainians, which basically enables French military instructors to attend or turn up at Ukrainian training facilities in Ukraine and basically start training. It's something that Emmanuel Macron has spoken about since February. He first sort of tried to have this strategic ambiguity and said, look, we might have to send troops to Ukraine. But that when basically he was challenged and his aides were challenged over like, oh, you're really going to go and start helping fight Russia? He was like, no, it's for training missions. It's for helping with logistics. And this is basically the first step. And it is positive because I can't remember the exact numbers that have gone through the British training, but let's say there's 100,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained by Europe and America on European soil. It's not really a sustainable practice if you're trying to mobilize a lot of men quickly, if you're having to transport them to, say, into Britain or Poland or wherever, France, Germany, Romania, to train them and then move them back into the country. So having Western trainers helping carry out this in Ukraine is very helpful. So Sersky, and I will read what he put on the Telegram messaging app last night. I welcome France's initiative to send instructors to Ukraine to train Ukrainian military personnel. As Dom said, I've already signed the documents that will allow the first French instructors to visit our training centre soon and familiarise themselves with their infrastructure and staff. I believe that France's determination will encourage other partners to join this ambitious project. This is what the French Defence Ministry, so they didn't actually reject the notion, had to say. As already mentioned several times, training on Ukrainian soil is one of the projects discussed since the conference on support for Ukraine convened by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, on February 26. Like all the projects discussed at the time, this track continues to the subject of work with the Ukrainians in particular to understand their attack needs. So basically, they've made a deal that basically the French are going to probably go and have a look at the training facilities and see what they can do there rather than actual training to begin soon. A slight rowback, but basically the French are going to visit a construction site which is being turned into a training centre. No idea where. I don't want to really speculate because it's only going to put people in danger, but it's going to be well behind the enemy lines and somewhere that they can turn over a significant number of new Ukrainian recruits as the mobilisation laws change and the recruitment phase steps up a little bit ahead of sort of reconstituting Ukraine's forces. So I guess the if in the if not when is shrinking. So it's more of a question of when, but it's not yet.
Yes, and of course, when you say that they'll be the French are going to look at these places behind enemy lines, I think you mean behind Ukrainian lines. Now, back to Jens Stoltenberg. He, as I say, speaking this morning at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in Sofia in Bulgaria, he then was talking about the issue of Western-supplied weapons being used inside Russia. And he said, and again, I apologise, quite a long quote, but this is such an important topic. We need to know exactly what these people are saying. Sometimes sound bites take it completely out of context. He said, "The time has come to consider whether it will be right to lift some of the restrictions which have been imposed, because we see now that especially in the Kharkiv region, the front line and the borderline is more or less the same. And of course, if they cannot attack military targets on Russian territory, then it ties one hand of the Ukrainians behind their back and makes it very hard for them to conduct defence, because they are attacked from Russian territory with missiles, airstrikes, artillery, and it's hard for them to respond because there are restrictions on some of the weapons they could use. We have to remember this is self-defence, and self-defence includes the right to also attack legitimate military targets inside Russia. That's self-defence, and they have the right to self-defence, and we should help them to uphold the right of self-defence. And therefore, some allies have lifted restrictions, enabling the Ukrainians to better defend themselves. And I think the time has come to consider also lifting other restrictions to help self-defence within the limitations of international law." Okay, end of the quote. I think you may have mentioned who had self-defence on the buzzword bingo because you've won today. But anyway, so pretty unequivocal there, really. I mean, he's caveating it, Joe, but it's fairly clear the direction of travel he sees this going in. Is this sort of him backing out the door, firing his rounds as he goes, saving the last one for himself, knowing that he's out of a job in a few months, or is this? Do you think this is actually not too great a leap ahead of where most NATO members are at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, Dom. I think it's a bit of both. So yes, Jens Stoltenberg is due out the door, I think, end of September, 1st of October, that Mark Rutte or whoever takes over as the next NATO Secretary General was meant to be in position. So Jens Stoltenberg is going out and he's trying to create a bit of a legacy for himself. But these are concerns that are being expressed to him from other NATO allies, and we can have a guess at who he's referring to. He's referring to the Americans, and he's referring to Germany. The Americans have had a strict no use of our weapons on Russian soil policy from the start of the war, start of the donations, and the Germans are refusing to send Taurus missiles, but I also guess they have a similar restriction on their weapons being used on the Russian mainland. it's an important one because Zelensky was saying that but we basically could see 10,000 Russian soldiers queuing up on the border of Kharkiv ready to launch the assault, but we couldn't do anything about it because we physically weren't allowed to shoot our weapons that we've been given by the West into that formation. So it basically gives the Russians carte blanche to form on one side of the border into an offensive position and then go. So yeah, Stoltenberg's being quite clever here. And he's become overtly more like the Secretary General of NATO is not a political role in as such. He's meant to be more of a chairman and sort of guiding the politicians' hands within the realms of keeping it NATO-ish. But he's become overtly more political with his support for Ukraine. And then his criticism of NATO member states. You can cast your minds back to before the US, the $60 billion supplemental for Ukraine was passed. He was calling out America. American politicians' delays are essentially causing Ukrainian deaths on the battlefield because they need this support badly. Now, this is just the next step of basically ratcheting up pressure on the Americans, on the Germans, on any other NATO ally that's refusing to let their weapons be fired onto Russian soil or being selective for what they can be used for targeting. But this is not a debate that's emerged like overnight. Yes, it's been sort of amplified, but I remember writing in April 2022, I think it was April the 26th or 24th, I can't remember, it's around late April, after 2 fuel depots or fuel dumps on Russian soil had been destroyed or they'd caught fire mysteriously. And the speculation was that some Ukrainians had used a Western weapon to sort of trigger and blow up these fuel dumps. And James Heapy was on LBC, I think it was, basically saying, well, so what? Like, this is a war. Ukraine is defending itself, and part of defending itself is being able to target Russian logistics deep behind enemy lines. And whether that is on Russian soil, that's on Russian soil. We, as the British government, are happy for that to happen. And David Cameron has reaffirmed that position more recently. So it's just a little bit of pressure, a little bit of politics. And and hopefully it has some fruition from it. Jens Stoltenberg is a sort of a vastly experienced guy. He's powerful. He doesn't always say the right thing, but on Ukraine, he's been pretty good, and people have listened to him. But yeah, let's see if it has the sort of the political attacks on the likes of the US and Germany come to fruition.
Yeah, indeed. And I note that I mentioned a moment ago, Radoslaw Sikorski, Poland's foreign minister, big article in a Polish newspaper this morning, big interview with him. He was saying that Poland is not going to rule out sending troops to Ukraine. He said we should not rule out any option. Let Putin guess what we'll do. Also, combined with that, Swedish Defence Ministry are also saying the same thing. And of course, Sweden producing CVR 90. Is it CVR 90? Is that what the infantry fighting vehicle? I think it's CVR 90. Anyway, a very capable infantry fighting vehicle, but also, and probably more importantly, the Archer self-propelled artillery unit, very, very capable, 60k range, can reach into Belgorod Oblast. So if Sweden is saying that is very notable. It's notable from all of them, actually. It's such an important point. But yeah, Sweden has got some very good stuff to offer there. Now, next one, Joe. Speaking about kit, I hear the Netherlands is casting around Europe trying to get donations of component parts to make up a Patriot air defence system. Interesting initiative to look around what's on the market and sort of Lego block them together and that kind of thing. How do you see that effort going? Is a hybrid system, if you buy the radar from one country and the launcher from another country, the missiles from a third, is that even technically possible? Are there so many headaches that it just wouldn't work? And Joe, what do we call it? Frankenriot? Freightriot? Patenstein?
I think the term has been Frankensam that the Ukrainians have liked to use for when they had been using Patriot launchers with old Soviet era radars from the S200, S300 era to sort of target Russian things in the sky. What the Dutch are trying to do is not create a Frankensam. They're trying to find people who have got spare Patriot parts. So a Patriot is, on the most basic level, rudimental level, has a command center where the guys who operate it sit. It has a launcher, can have multiple launchers, and it has a radar. The Dutch basically have said, look, we have core components of Patriot in our stocks that we can actually send to Ukraine, but it probably doesn't make up a full battery with X amount of launchers, and we don't have the missiles to do. So what they're doing is they are going around to the European countries and other people who they know have Patriot systems. So whether it be the Greeks, the Romanians, the Spanish, the Poles have got some, the Germans, but they've just donated one. And have their own air defence initiative, which I'll go to later. The Netherlands have put out a press release this morning saying, look, we've identified countries we believe could offer additional Patriot parts and munitions. And the Defence Minister of the Netherlands, Kajsa Ollongren, has called on them to contribute from their existing stocks, like the Netherlands has decided to do. And this is what she had to say. We are engaged in talks with partners to compile a Patriot system, including training for Ukrainian crews, without offer, and consulting with partners countries, providing several key parts and munitions. We can provide Ukraine with at least one fully operational system in a short time frame. So basically, the Dutch know that whole Patriot systems are scarce, they're very limited, and they're often being used to defend NATO territory. So they're looking to say, look, have you got any spare parts? And we can kind of cobble together a Patriot battery. So interesting way of looking at it. It's not sort of being done as vocally as this before. But what I find really interesting is the Dutch are going one step further and saying, look, the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, recently said that as NATO countries, we can temporarily move below the alliance's capability targets. NATO has a series of rules, basically, that it has to have X amount of coverage from air defense systems, whether it be Patriot or other things. But in recent months, countries have basically said, Jens Stoltenberg has echoed this, look, we don't have to defend ourselves as much because our main adversary is Russia and they're too busy attacking Ukraine. So we can sort of take our foot off of the gas somewhat. So basically, the Dutch are saying, look, let's go below that target. Let's get a Patriot battery to Ukraine, and let's wait for our industrial suppliers that have pledged to speed up. So Raytheon make the Patriot, and they've pledged to speed up production to deliver replacement systems. And we are counting on that. That's what the Dutch have to say. It's interesting that the Dutch have launched this effort at the same time as the Germans. The Germans about a month ago launched what they called the Air Defence Coalition, where they basically pleaded for European countries, but also they went to the Middle East. I think Saudi Arabia and a few other countries have air defence systems. And all that Germany has managed to get from their efforts is one Patriot system to Ukraine, and that was donated from their stocks. A little fun story. The Germans went to the French and said, oh, have you got anything that you'd be able to donate? Because the Ukrainians particularly like the SAMP-T, which is the Franco-Italian air defense system, which is known to have been able to knock the Kinzhal hypersonic missile out of the sky well. And the French replied back going, no, because we need our systems to defend Paris and France during the Olympics. The Germans have basically said, but hang on, we've got the European Championships as well, and we've had threats from Islamic fundamentalists. And I was just sort of laughing with someone going, yes, while these are all serious sort of threats, the most sort of most danger any German is going to probably get from the sky is a Harry Kane penalty during the European Championships. So there's a lot of sort of hiding behind, we need our kit still, and the Dutch are really trying to force that issue and say, look, hang on, come on, guys, we don't really need it as much as the Ukrainians now. So let's take a little bit of risk and help the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, the whole Olympics thing is going to be fascinating. We'll have to have a look at that later in the year because, I mean, they want to have the opening ceremony on the Seine, on the river. I mean, it's an absolute security headache. People who I speak to in security circles, they are just, those that have got nothing to do with it are just sort of looking on with wide-eyed horror and a little bit of schadenfreude. And those that have actually got a dog in the fight, I mean, they are just terrified at how they're going to secure that whole opening ceremony, let alone the rest of the Olympics. I think, didn't we stick a Type 45 destroyer on the Thames or to put a big air defence bubble over London for the 2012 Olympics? Might come to that. Anyway, we will see in due course. Last one I want to talk to you about, Joe. This kind of went a little bit unnoticed last week, but I think it's very interesting now. Now there's been a few days of comparative calm afterwards, and it's the comparative calm that I think is the most interesting bit of it. You may remember last week, Ukraine hit a Russian radar site, in Krasnodar. That's the oblast to the east of the Sea of Azov, which is thought to be part of Moscow's ballistic missile monitoring system. So watching out for nukes and stuff like that. But it can also be used to track Ukrainian, well, not just Ukrainian, but anyone, ATACMS strikes and other sort of ballistic missiles. And the one that was hit covers Crimea. Now, quick segue. This is all part, I think, of Ukraine's effort to make Crimea just militarily unhelpful almost to Putin. Put your stuff there if you like, but we'll start plinking them out. We're just going to knock out everything that you put there. So yeah, there's the land war, the Black Sea war, but you've also got to think about the missile war and what it's doing in terms of territory and how it's denying some areas of territory to Russia and the long-term implications of that. Anyway, so I think that was what it was all about. But you start hitting bits of Russia or anyone's nuclear warning and response system, puts hairs back on the backs of people's necks. And it stoked fears of nuclear escalation because Russia have this self-declared, or their policy on nuclear use, their use of nuclear arms includes if their nuclear infrastructure is attacked. So if they think that, oh my God, we're going to lose all our ability to fight a nuclear war, they reserve the right for themselves to fire their weapons at potentially a much lower threshold than we in the West would. So attack on this little bit of Russian nuclear infrastructure had a lot of people saying, oh my God, what are you doing, Ukraine? You're just absolutely poking the bear, and you're also sticking one up to Biden. He's not going to be happy with this, etc., etc. But Ukraine clearly see the need to hit such things so that just on ATACMS into Crimea, they can get through. And also, importantly, they are obviously, clearly prepared to call Putin's bluff on the nuclear side. Now, I say the comparative calm over the last few days has been very telling. I was surprised that Russia didn't come out with the latest round of nuclear saber rattling in order to try and stoke these fears in the West. So I think this has been a very, you could say, it's a high stakes roll the dice gamble by Ukraine. I don't know what conversations, if any, happened behind closed doors. But remember, it wasn't that long ago that we think the US was saying to Ukraine, stop hitting oil refineries. Now they're going for the nuclear infrastructure. They don't seem to care what the Biden administration is saying, probably because they are not saying, yes, you can use our weapons inside Russia. But Joe, how wise do you think this kind of attack has been in regard to shoring up support among allies and supporters of Ukraine? Do you think there's a risk that for all the military good that could come of it, there could be a bigger political damage because of it?
Yeah, for sure. I think the political fallout of spooking the Americans, spooking the Germans, is going to do no favours to Ukraine in terms of convincing them that once we've got your kit and once we're allowed to use it, because I presume a lot of the high-tech kit that is given to Ukraine is geofenced, so it basically the missiles will have some sort of self-destruct mechanism if they stray out of their allowed usage areas. I don't know, that's what I presume they're high-tech enough to do that. It's an assumption rather than a bit of knowledge, but there's been a lot of talk about geofenced kit in the past. So yeah, look, it's going to do them no favors. But then on the other hand, you could look at it and say, hang on, look what we can do anyway. We're going to keep doing this and hitting sort of controversial targets until you give us the permission to use ATACMS on Russian soil to hit troop gatherings or production facilities or something like that. But then is it also not good? The Ukrainians are playing Putin's bluff, and the Russians have been very, very quiet on this. I don't think they really want to admit that the Ukrainians have not just hit this thing once, but they've hit it twice in the last week or so. And there's rumours around that it might have also have been hit previously, and we just never really heard of it because it was hushed up. But these things are really, really high value targets, and sort of a hat tip to Tom Withington of Rusi here. And he was saying, look, these are really high value targets. If anyone was to sort of want to carry out a nuclear strike on Russia, these would be the first things, these early warning, these over the horizon detection radars that would be targeted. You would blow them up and then suddenly they wouldn't see things coming at them. So Ukraine have done a good thing by admitting that they are responsible for these strikes. It takes away any ambiguity. It basically gives the West something to hide behind, saying it wasn't us, it was Ukraine. We didn't tell them to do it. They used their own drones to do it. But what I was sort of speculating and hinting at when I was looking into it was, why is Ukraine doing this? Yes, the prestige of sort of saying, look, what we can do, we can hit 1,800 kilometers behind the front line and hit targets that you hold absolutely dear to your sort of national security, and do it with relative ease. Like it must be quite embarrassing for the Russians to say that they've got drones flying 1,800 kilometers over their country without being able to shoot them down or get rid of them before they hit their destined target. But the other thing is, Ukraine is preparing the battlefield, is preparing for F-16s to arrive, and these things can pick up F-16s being flown around. As much as you hit these things and make them unusable, it does potentially give Ukraine just that inch, that millimeter of advantage when it comes to being able to fly their F-16s slightly closer to the front line without them being at risk from Russian surface-to-air missiles or other Russian aircraft. So there are probably some reasons why the Ukrainians are doing this. It's a great propaganda coup for them. But yeah, it's not really going to sort of endear the Western governments who are considering and pondering over whether they give Ukraine access to fire their weapons into Russian territory.
Yes, although I think it would generate a number of conversations behind closed doors of people saying there's a bluff being called there. Maybe we could push a little ourselves. I speculate, but I thought it was very interesting that there was no response from Russia at all, saying that this is an outrage and we're going to do X, Y, and Z and all the rest of it. Not even Medvedev. I mean, crikey, if ever there was someone you could expect to put the glass down and then get on the airwaves and start spouting off about nuclear stuff, it'd be him. But anyway, not even him. Coming up, we go to our final thoughts. Joe, probably best that you come in now. Any final thoughts?
I just think we're at a really interesting sort of crossroads now, where we're coming up to lots that can be done on the NATO front, lots can be done bilaterally. I don't think we're a million miles away from sort of getting over the real hurdles and basically calling Putin's bluff when it comes to this, like the nuclear rhetoric or war with NATO. Like he already says he's at war with NATO, so why do we have to worry about sending troops, even if they're only in Ukraine to train or to help maybe repair a tank or two or whatever? I think we're sort of at this moment where we're starting to realise that Vladimir Putin might have thrown sort of everything he's willing to do at it because he doesn't want to go any further. And things like these Ukrainian strikes on Russia's nuclear deterrence sort of plays into that a little bit more, because it says it like if Vladimir Putin isn't going to respond to that, what is he going to respond to? It's not going to be a HIMARS strike on Belgorod. It's not going to be an attack and landing in Crimea or whatever. It's we've tested his red lines, and we're actually realizing that we can probably probe a lot further than most initially thought when Russia invaded in 2022.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter or X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.